I'm Dr. Wes Kennemore, and this is my 9/11 story. This was before I went to medical school, and I was working as an engineering program and project manager for DataStream Systems. We had been hired to implement a new computerized maintenance management system, or in the vernacular of our trade, an enterprise asset management system, to manage the president's mobile communications equipment. I had been asked to lead that project, and we kicked off on Monday, September 10th, working inside a small, secure facility located within the greater confines of the Anacostia Naval Annex. The organization we were working with was called the White House Communications Agency, or WACA for short. Of course, we were all civilians, and getting onto the Anacostia Annex was difficult enough, but in order to get into the WACA facility, we had to go through an additional level of security and be cleared by a bunch of Marines, and we actually had to wear these little red identification badges all the time. And that red badge basically meant that we had to be escorted by someone who was authorized at all times. Anyway, on Monday, when we got cleared through, the rest of the day went fairly normally, like any other implementation project would. And of course, we had to go through all the same hassles in reverse to check out. The morning of Tuesday, September 11th, began pretty much like any other day. My team and I drove in from our hotel. We jumped through all the hoops we had to jump through to get onto the Anacostia Annex. And as we were clearing into the WACA facility, our escort came down and told us that a plane had flown into one of the Twin Towers. And I honestly just assumed this was a small private plane and that it was probably some kind of pilot error or accident. But as we were clearing through, our escort looked at me and said, "No, this was a big plane." Now, this clearly wasn't normal, but of course we're dealing with a military organization. They're used to dealing with crises, so we went in and began to work on our project, began interviewing our people, trying to develop the workflows, just basically approaching this like any normal project while things were going on all around us. As we were sitting at the conference table, I remember hearing somebody say, "There's another plane that's headed for the towers." And we all stood up from our conference table. We walked over to the corner and looked up at a television that was up in the corner of the room. And we got there just about 30 seconds before the plane hit the second tower. And you could almost palpably feel the tension in the room increase. And we all just kind of stood there in awe for a few minutes, trying to process, I guess, what was going on. But eventually, after a few minutes, we kind of began to take it in and recognize that things were happening in New York. We were in Washington, and we had a job to do. So we started filtering back toward the conference table to try to start our work again. And I will remember this like it was yesterday. All of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I see this individual running out of one of the offices, and one of the Coast Guard officers there started screaming at the top of his lungs, "Oh my God, they just hit the Pentagon!" You might imagine that at that moment, literally all hell broke loose in the room. All of our escorts left the table and went back to their offices and to their normal workspaces and began investigating and figuring out what their specific responsibilities were going to be in the midst of this unprecedented tragedy. My team and I were sitting at this conference table, and I remember after about 15 or 20 minutes, I hunted down one of the senior enlisted guys and I said, "Look, clearly you guys are not prepared to deal with my team today. I'll take my team, I'll leave. You tell us when you want us back." And there was this pause. And the guy looked at me and said, "Wes, you don't understand. He said, in the first place, this Waka facility is totally locked down. Nobody in, nobody out, no reasons, period. You're stuck. If for some reason you could get out of the Waka facility, the Anacostia Naval Annex that we're on, it's also locked down. Nobody in, nobody out, no excuses, no exceptions. And by the way, that red badge you're wearing, as of 5 minutes ago, became a shoot-on-sight badge. That got my attention. I remember I said, excuse me, what? And he said, you know that red badge requires that you be escorted at all times. And essentially, at this moment, we're operating as though we're in a state of war. And if you are seen more than 4 or 5 feet away from somebody who's wearing an authorized escort badge, our security has been authorized to assume you're hostile and shoot you on sight. I almost remember, it was almost comical. I sort of looked at it. This is my chair. I remember sitting down very gently. This is my chair. You tell me when I can move. And I literally spent the next several hours, my team and I, being guarded by a 19-year-old, a kid that was younger than my own son, guarding us with a machine gun. And we stayed that way for several hours before we were ever permitted to leave the facility. And then we had to be escorted out of the facility. We had to be escorted off the Anacostia Naval Annex. And it was just surreal. As we sat around that conference table, being guarded by this kid, and military officers would be walking past us on their way from one meeting to another, there would be little snippets of conversation that you could overhear about an expected secondary attack or a possible terrorist spotting in location X, Y, or Z. And of course, none of my team was really cleared for any kind of top secret information, so all we had was what we could hear going on around us. And at some point in the middle of all of this, one of the military officers recognized that this consulting team should probably let their families know they're okay. So he arranged for us to get an escort to a telephone where we were each allotted exactly 2 minutes to tell our families that we were safe and that we'd be out as soon as we could, but that we really weren't allowed to give any other information. Not that we had any other solid information to provide anyway. My wife had actually left that morning on a short vacation trip with her mother and her 2 sisters to Pigeon Forge. And of course, my son was back in Birmingham staying with a friend. So basically, I'm stranded in Washington. She's in Pigeon Forge, and God knows what's going to happen. And my son is back in Birmingham. And all I could think about after hearing all of this conversation about more attacks and, potential war, and all I could think about was, what if we're both stranded away from home and we can't get there, and how are we ever going to connect up again, and what about our son? And so to put this in perspective, you'd have to know my wife. She absolutely hates to be told what to do. I mean, her worst thing in the world. She hates to be told what to do. But I got to hand it to her. This time I called her cell phone. She answers the phone, and I said, "Hey, babe, I'm fine. I'm on lockdown. I'm in a secure facility. I'll let you know when I could get out, but don't ask any questions. Get your mother, get your sisters, go home, and I will talk to you as soon as I can." And to her credit, she just said, "Okay, I love you." She didn't ask what was going on. She didn't challenge. She didn't do anything. She just accepted it because she understood the gravity of the situation. We spent the next couple of days basically sitting around our hotel, trying to find a rental car. I mean, by now, the planes had all been grounded. There was no way we could fly home. Rental cars were completely exhausted. Fortunately, we had one between our team, but I was the only one going south. The rest of the team was headed out toward Ohio. And so I was the team leader, but that was sort of my responsibility at that point to allow those guys to try to get home. And I remember you find out who your friends are, because there were two different men from our church that found out I was in Washington, found out I was stranded, and two different men from our church called my wife and said basically some variant of, look, we'll get a couple guys together, we'll get in a car, we'll go get him. We'll just drive up and pick him up, 20 hours and drive him back. Fortunately, they didn't have to do that, but it was good to know that they would. And anyway, we found out that a friend of ours, my wife's best friend at the time, was in New York City when all of this occurred. And she too was trying to find a way home. It turns out she had a rental car and she had managed to make her way into Baltimore. And I was able to get my team to drop me in Baltimore, and I connected up with Jeannie, my wife's friend, connected up with Jeannie, and she and I drove home to Birmingham. But even now, 20 years later, I still get goosebumps when I think about that day. It's so vivid and so real that it just... I was telling my wife last night, sometimes it's almost haunting to relive the memories of that day.